This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Harper.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom, click the big red button that says Patreon, and maybe subscribe. Any amount helps, and we're counting on you. Every week, we bring you interviews with authors of books, research, and other products that we consider fascinating.
Our guest today is Paul Mendes-Flohr, a professor emeritus of Jewish thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as the University of Chicago. He's the author of a new book entitled Martin Buber, A Life of Faith and Dissent. It was published last year by Yale University Press. Professor Paul Mendes-Flohr, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
So how should we view Buber, do you think? Is he a philosopher, a theologian, a political activist, a Zionist, a man?
Which is the number one identity that interests you in the book?
I think he's a genuinely thoughtful human being. And his thoughts are inflected by various perspectives, disciplines, but in essence, he's just a thoughtful, caring human being and self-reflective in many respects. He's aware that he is fallible, certainly like myself and anyone else that I know, and he was constantly correcting himself, amending his positions, and that's what I find noble and edifying and engaging. He was not dogmatic, if you wish to put it in those terms.
Is that why he's such a towering figure in terms of his lasting impact?
Yes, I would think so. It's the dialogical tone which he eventually developed, dialogue with himself and others, and that means being open to the others. A friend of his, Franz Rosenzweig, said in dialogue, one realizes the other person doesn't have only ears to hear what one says, but a mouth to speak. And dialogue is always between two, and it has the grammar is established by their discussion, by their exchange of opinions, and regard for the integrity of the other.
The interesting thing is that your biography of him is not just an intellectual biography. It's actually recounting much of his personal life as well as his personal relationships, including with his mother, who abandoned him at a young age, and his wife, who influenced him a lot. What do you think is the interplay between him as a thinker and him as a human being? Yes.
You mentioned his relationship with his mother. When you read in the book, and perhaps the audience has fully had the opportunity to read the book, Buber's mother abandoned his family, his father, and never really bid him properly goodbye. And that left a major scar, lacerated his soul, if you wish, and alerted him to the fragility of relationships and the fear that he had, and many do, of a genuine relationship. So I understand the trajectory of his intellect and spiritual life, emotional life, to be anchored in that understanding or that fear, that anxiety, that trauma, that relationships are fragile. And dialogue, as Buber understood, is not just simply an intellectual exchange, as I perhaps suggested previously, but it's an existential mode of interacting with other human beings to acquire trust. And trust can easily be violated. If I can anticipate one of your questions, as I understand them, his relationship to Franz Rosenzweig. And that came fairly late in his life, in his mid-40s. And Rosenzweig, who had extraordinary intellectual integrity and emotional, existential integrity, obliged Buber to abandon his honor. Honor is a term he uses, that human beings also develop sort of protective covering, the way we present ourselves to other people. And that means, obviously, we don't allow the other person to truly enter our being. A colleague of Buber's, the great psychiatrist Karl Jaspers, elaborating Buber's position, noted that each of us develop over the years very subtle, nuanced ways, perhaps not even totally aware of what we're doing. We develop like a shell. A snail has a shell, it protects itself. And as soon as there's a shadow of a threat, the snail withdraws into the shell. But the shell not is only a shelter, but it also is a way of avoiding true contact with the outside world, with the others. And when you're in the shell, only when we're able to leave the shell, we develop trust, can we really truly be ourselves. And trust always comes with another person. If I can elaborate this, what is crucial for Buber in his major book, that was a breakthrough, was not just simply an intellectual development, but as we would say in Hebrew, a cheshbon nefesh, a way of coming to terms of who he was in mid-40s, was the distinction between, well, the very title in German, Ich und Du, translated somewhat awkwardly in English as I, thou, or Hebrew somewhat without proper nuance as ani v'ata. But du in German is reserved. It's the intimate personal noun as opposed to a more formal one, sie. In most relationships in German, when you speak to another human being, you say sie. But du is reserved for relationships between parent and child and the very closest friends. And ultimately, when we address God, even though God is referred to as the King of the universe, we say du. Du is an intimate pronoun that's available, that is anchored in trust. I'll give you an example. Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, whom I mentioned previously, were close friends, a very crucial friendship for Buber. But they addressed one another as sie. After almost 8 years of relationship, and a very close relationship, collaboration, Rosenzweig inadvertently addressed Buber as du, and then quickly apologized. And Buber said, no, we are ready. We are ready. 8 years to say du. And then Rosenzweig wrote a little poem allowing himself to say du, and then Buber's, but then he added, in my heart, I would continue to say sie. Nor is respect.
This is lovely.
Is there more yeka exchange than that, I wonder?
Now, we're not interrupting you. I want to clarify. We are not interrupting you because this is not interesting. I think we could talk about Buber endlessly, so this episode could be hours long. But I do want to go back because the great advantage of reading a whole biography is to be able to start at the beginning. And since we talked about the abandonment of his mother, which certainly set his psychological tone, can I ask you about his contextual environment? Because I see one of the big internal conflicts or contradictions within Buber as this tension between cosmopolitanism and universal, broad-thinking universal approaches to alongside a sort of intimate commitment to Judaism. And I want to learn about the cosmopolitan side. It sounds like he grew up in an environment of the late Habsburg Empire with an incredible proficiency in languages and culture and music and art. And I love the anecdote about his literary debut in which he brings in all of that. Tell us more about these forces that shaped him at that time.
Certainly. Buber was typical of not typical and yet obviously unique in terms of, or distinctive in terms of who he was, but typical in the sense that he had a broad humanistic education. Languages were very crucial, and Buber spoke numerous languages. Classic languages, Greek and Latin, with excellent French and Italian. Actually, he and his wife at dinner would always speak Italian. They just loved the language. And when they were still young, they went to Florence, Italy for a year, and hired a maid who spoke pure, what they considered pure Italian. She lived in the home, hardly ever learned German, but spoke beautiful Italian, and that's an indication. But he spoke, of course, English very well, undoubtedly German, and Polish was his first literary language, was Polish and Yiddish. He and Agnon, with whom he became very close, and they always spoke Yiddish to one another. And Buber was not really a German Jew. He was always he was raised culturally in the Habsburg Empire, and very strong roots in East European Yiddish culture. And that is obscured by many of Buber's expositors because he was largely perceived as a German Jewish intellectual. But he also saw himself as a bridge between Jewish sensibilities and culture and the general cosmopolitan culture of which you speak. And here I'd like to make if you allow me, make a point which I think is crucial, understanding Buber. Buber realized that the particular need not be in contradiction with the universal. And ultimately, all particulars have a universal grounding. As we would say in Hebrew, the Shorosh Nishmato, the source of one's soul, is, of course, particular, but it's fed by many tributaries. All cultures are not that insular, but what is crucial, that there's some universal ground of all particularities. So Buber was once asked, why does he address the world through Hasidism? If he has a universal message, why should he clothe it within Judaism? And Buber's answer was that I need not leave my home and cross the threshold in order to speak to humanity. And that's where he saw himself, as speaking to fundamental human concerns, but with a Jewish voice, a Jewish culture, with Jewish cultural inflections. So it's not really to say particular and universal as they're two separate for Buber. They are ultimately one. And therefore, he was able to listen to Chinese culture. As you perhaps know, he translated many Chinese works to Finnish culture, and the great epics of Finland, and brought together in one of his early works what he called ecstatic confessions from numerous cultures, Christian, but also and Islamic, but also so-called non-theistic cultures. All of them, the cultures of the world, one great canopy, if you wish, of a mosaic. All have particular voices, but they speak to each of us. And that's the understanding of the university, ultimately, is that when we study Chinese literature, we're not voyeurs, or I study feminist literature or gay literature. I'm not simply curious, but all those various cultures speak to me, because we're one basic family, if you wish.
But in many ways, Paul, this tension between particularism and universalism is the main feature of modern Jewish thought in general, of the Haskalah. Yeah. What do you think is Buber's main contribution in this respect to understanding or to resolving or addressing that tension?
Yeah, I think Buber was deeply concerned about that tension, and he felt it really was a travesty, if you wish. One way of understanding the trajectory of modern Jewish thought is that it becomes increasingly anthrocentric, or as one my colleague put it, the natural Jew. The Jew who has political, social, cultural, economic interests eclipse the theocentric Jew. The Jew who largely beholden to God and the Torah God revealed and gave to the Jewish people, the covenant. But what occurs in that trajectory, from the theocentric traditional Jew to an Afrocentric Jew, is reducing Judaism to an identity. In this respect, Buber was concerned about reducing Judaism to an ethnocentric identity, and Zionism was problematic for Buber. He was a Zionist out of solidarity of his fellow Jews, but also wary of Zionism reducing Judaism to the politics of identity, of an ethnocentrism. And within the context of Zionism, he sought to extricate the movement from its type of nationalism, so self-enclosed, ethnocentric nationalism. And of course, together with people like Echad Ha'am, cultural Zionists, to adjust Judaism to a modern post-Enlightenment culture and sensibilities, as I understood, tried to explain beforehand.
I want to stop you on the issue of Zionism to get into a little bit more deeply his journey from his earliest years of a commitment to Zionism, because I found it quite interesting that in his early years, when he's still struggling with his, sort of developing his thought, he has a nationalist streak himself, and even kind of supports a sort of Polish nationalism, then Zionism. He's not a pacifist at pre-World War I. You talk about his friend labeling him the Kriegsbuber, this sort of supportive of the war side of him. How does he make that journey from somebody who had some instincts for nationalism to this divergence with what Zionism was becoming, and in some ways diminishing the commitment to a sovereign state and favoring a different kind of redemption for the Jewish people?
Yes, as I alluded to in the beginning of our conversation, Buber's path is, of course, dialogical, as he would have put it, constantly self-corrective, which is noble. In my youth, I was very fascinated by Bertrand Russell. In his 90s, he made a fundamental alteration of the way he was thinking, revision. And that's what's noble about an intellectual, an honest intellectual. He constantly revising his positions as he encounters himself, ourself, and the world. It's true that Buber, he was raised, as I think you noted, in a traditional home, in the home of his grandparents, who were observant Jews, what we now call Orthodox Jews. His grandmother wore a sheitel, a wig, strictly Orthodox. And as soon as he got to the university, he abandoned that orthodoxy of his youth and sought to forge a new identity. Initially not necessarily a Jewish one, but a cultural Viennese identity, a cosmopolitan identity, as we noted beforehand. And eventually found himself in the ranks of the Zionist movement to, as many early Zionists, was to redefine their Jewish identity, their Jewish loyalties, fidelities. But very quickly, he was disaffected with political Zionism of Herzl and emphasized the cultural renewal, the spiritual renewal of Judaism within the context of modern concerns. And that's also true of his early involvement with Polish nationalism, which was very humanistic, the brand of Polish nationalism that he identified with as a young man in his late teens. And his struggle with Zionism was, I think, at least one that I must admit resonates with me, one of how you mediate between solidarity of your people, particularly in a time where they were under assault by anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism, we must remember, is not simply bad opinions about the Jews. It was anchored in political doctrines and racial documents. The Jews were incorrigibly evil. There's nothing that they could be baptized, get nose jobs, and the like, and they'll remain wickedly Jewish. And of course, they'll culminate in the Third Reich and the final solution. So Buber that's the context of his Jewishness. He would not abandon the Jewish people. Many of his closest allies, colleagues, did abandon the Zionist movement. The most famous one is Hans Cohen, who wrote a marvelous biography of Buber in the 30s.
And the subject of a great Tel Aviv Review podcast.
Yeah, with Dr. Adi Gordon, who wrote a biography of Hans Cohen recently.
Yes, certainly. And I think I might give him a footnote or two. In any event, Hans Cohen, as you recall from the interview with Adi Gordon, concluded that Zionism is not Judaism, and he left the Zionist movement. Buber didn't, although he shared many of the political and ethical concerns of Hans Cohen. He remained fidelitous to the Jewish people, but within the context of what we now would call the loyal opposition. He was wary of the directions of Zionism, but would not abandon the Jewish people. And that's probably true of many today who have misgivings about Israeli policies, but still remain committed Jews or committed even Israelis and Zionists. And that's what's striking about Buber's voice, is that he both critical, deeply concerned about the political direction that the Zionist movement was taking, but would not abandon his fellow Jews, especially in a period of not only existential threat, but physical threat.
I'd be curious to know about one more aspect of his Zionism, which is why and how did Buber seem to reject the classical Zionist view at the time in the emerging Zionism of the 20s and 30s, the denigration of the diaspora Jew? He sort of rejected that image that the diaspora Jew is fundamentally scarred, as you put it. And if you can continue to explain to us what was his understanding of the, am I going to say this right, Judentum instead?
And then I didn't catch your last word.
You try.
Judentum?
No, I think you're making a distinction between Judennot, the stress of the Jews, as opposed to the Not des Judentums, the stress of Judaism. Not means emergency concerns and issues. If that's the distinction you're alluding to.
Well, maybe start with his understanding or his some opposition or rejection of the idea that there's something wrong with being a diaspora Jew in the Zionist approach.
Yeah. What Buber was concerned about was the loss of nuance in terms of the Galut Jew. He was certainly aware of it. That in exile, Judaism had undergone fundamental distortions in terms of its self-understanding, its relationship to non-Jews, and ultimately a relationship to ourselves. It was not a natural situation. And here, as a teacher, I have to explain to contemporary Jews, particularly those who come from Anglo-Saxon countries, that When we speak of exile, it's not the same thing as diaspora. Exile is a fundamental flaw on the way Jews relate to themselves and God. Interesting, when traditional Jews for 2 millennia would reflect on Galut, exile, they didn't blame or even think about Titus and the political events. It was a relationship to the divine. And it was a cosmic disruption because of we lost the temple, which was considered what we say, Axis Mundi, the center of the world, the umbilical cord of the created order. So it became a metaphysical and theological concern. But within that, particularly there was a transition from the supernatural Jew, as we indicated before, to a natural Jew. Jewish sensibilities became very confused and uncertain. Very telling comment that Buber makes early in his life is that what Zionism will bring to the Jews is, I'll say in German, Entscheidungsfähigkeit, the ability to make decisions. The Galut Jew is so uncertain, cannot really make clear decisions about life, about himself. It's a constant state of ambiguity and existential uncertainty. And Zionism will restore to the Jews the ability to make sober, thoughtful, rational decisions with full existential grounding, self-assurance, if you wish. In other words, Zionism was understood for many to be a movement of healing. And that is the cultural dimension. And sometimes we prefer to call it a spiritual dimension because of the notion of healing the Jews from the scars, as you put it, of Galut, particularly from the modern context, where we no longer have a clear sense of ourselves religiously, and now we enter the ambiguities of the modern world in general. So Zionism had many, like the Jacob's coat, many nuanced colors. There was a political Zionist who were responding largely to anti-Semitism, and those who sought to rehabilitate the Jews culturally and spiritually. And what Buber was concerned about is those who totally rejected Galut as being perverse, etc. There was noble moments in the Galut. That is the religious sensibilities of the Hasidim and others. So unlike Achad Am, which Buber is usually associated with, the cultural Zionists, the spiritus rectus of cultural Zionism, Achad Am, Buber was also concerned about rescuing what he called Jewish religiosity, not in Zionism, totally a secular culture, as Achad Am envisioned, but to rescue the religious sensibilities that had taken shape within the Galut.
So what was it that led to his disillusionment with Zionism? It wasn't as radical as Hans Korn's, but to an extent, he was much more ambivalent and skeptical about it than he had been. What was the watershed?
Yes, I think the neglect of the cultural and spiritual dimension. You might even call it the psychological dimension of Zionism. Herzl's singular focus on the political aspect and the willingness to engage in realpolitik, which Buber felt would undermine the spiritual integrity of Judaism, the ethical traditions of Judaism. So Buber sought to adjust Judaism not simply as a secular culture as indicated, but also as a spiritual culture. And that came very early in his relationship to political Zionism. Herzl recognized Buber's talent and appointed him to be the editor of the Zionist newspaper, Die Welt. But within that context, Buber very early, still in his early 20s, moved in the direction of a more culturally and spiritually sensitive Zionism.
And how much was the catalyst for that movement his close friend Gustav Landauer? Can you tell us about how that influenced him?
Yes, that came a bit later. Landauer was in many ways Buber's mentor, intellectual mentor and spiritual mentor. What's crucial about Landauer, as I imagine that's what you're referring to, is Landauer was an anarchist and opposed the notions of that human beings, and he was concerned about the healing not of Jewish society, but of modern urban society, and not to depend on the state and government, but individuals and community. And the community must make those. And they use the word healing, the healing of the fabric of human relationships, and that was crucial for Buber. Although it took a while for Buber to fully appreciate Landauer's positions, as you mentioned that during the First World War, Buber was eager to identify with the German cause and became a German nationalist in many respects. And this was a sobering experience. The enthusiasm, the exuberance of of going to battle. Buber was not a soldier, but he was in the chorus of the patriots, of the German patriots. And by the way, he was still not a German citizen. He was an Austrian citizen, and only after the war did he become a German citizen. However, he was inebriated like millions of other citizens and subjects of the German order, including the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, of the German cause. And Landau, who was a pacifist, sought to wrench Buber from that inebriated patriotism. And eventually Buber did come to understand the horror of political nationalism. And that was decisive in his relationship to Zionism. He sought to steer Zionism from political nationalism. And he made a very crucial speech in the post-World War I Zionist Congress, the distinction between nationalism, which seeks to heal, and what we call hyperbolic nationalism, self-enclosed, ethnocentric nationalism. And that was, he felt, was a great, not only was it in itself problematic for Buber, ethnocentric nationalism, but it vitiated, it undermined what he felt was the spiritual task of Zionism, to heal the Jews of the distorted moments of godly national experience, particularly through the secularization brought by the Enlightenment and emancipation, but to rescue the spiritual patronymy of Judaism, the spiritual heritage of Judaism. And thus he worked a great deal on the Bible, as you perhaps undoubtedly know, and presented Hasidism as he understood it.
But we can't finish this interview without talking about his political activism, because you do refer to him also as a political activist at points. And if we can collapse his entire life in Israel, which is long, into just one question, what do you think were his what was his most controversial political position? Because he had several of them, and I'm thinking of the ones you point out. For example, his call to the Israeli government to do justice for the Palestinian refugees, or opposing the death penalty for Eichmann. How did he arrive at such controversial positions, and what are the ones that stand out to you?
Yes, indeed. We mentioned his cosmopolitan sensibilities and views, which he expressed when speaking to his fellow Jews in Zionism, is to remind them that we are the children of Amos, the prophet. Remember, Amos opens up, and actually by chance it was my bar mitzvah haftarah. I only appreciate it that way.
So you feel very close to this.
No, it's all in the stars.
Right. When Amos says, I'm also the God of the Ethiopians. I've liberated the Ethiopians, not only the Israelites. And that is the heartbeat of Judaism that Buber sought to amplify. That the God of Israel is not only the God of the Jews, but also, in this case, of the Palestinians. Zionism cannot be at the expense of the people living here for hundreds of years, thousands of years, namely the Palestinian population. And he sought to alert the Zionist leadership not to understandable efforts to create a home for the Jewish people as the center for the rehabilitation of the Jewish body politic, as well as soul of the Jewish people, at the expense of the Palestinians. And so he voiced opposition to the leadership of Zionism in the 20s and 30s and 40s that ignored the ethical and political reality of the Palestinians living here. And so he was endorsed the notion of a binational state. And only was this crucial, never as an ideological dogma, but simply as a direction of our thought, how we can possibly accommodate Jewish and understandable, legitimate Jewish concerns without violating the integrity of the Arab concerns, the Palestinian concerns. And as you undoubtedly noted in his biography, that he opposed the establishment of the State of Israel before there was, without an agreement with the Palestinians, somehow to accommodate both political realities and social and human realities, ultimately. And thus he insisted that the land of Israel is a land of two peoples. By chance, I was asked by Buber's son. I didn't know Buber himself, but I was very close to his son and his other children, his other daughter and grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren. And so anyway, Martin Buber's son approached me saying he doesn't understand much of his father's legacy. His father had just passed away. But what was crucial to him was his father's understanding of the Arab question. And he invited me to assemble Buber's writings on the Arab question. which was published under the title of A Land of Two Peoples. And Buber, from the very beginning, he opposed the Balfour Declaration because it just neglected the political, cultural, and human reality of the Palestinians.
Yeah, I found that a shocking part of the book. I have to say, it's way in the beginning, but I was struck by that.
Yeah.
Right.
Paul, there's maybe a question before we wrap up. There seems to be a renewed scholarly interest in Buber and his environs, in intellectual environs. There's your book, as well as Uri Ram, who wrote a biography of Buber recently, and also Zohar Maor of Bar-Ilan University. We had him on recently. He was also engaged in Buber scholarship, as well as the other books. The Adi Gordon biography of Hans Kohn that we mentioned. There are a few new biographies of Gershom Scholem. This whole gang of German-speaking intellectuals in Jerusalem in the interwar period. Why do you think that is?
Yes. I wrote several years ago an essay which addressed that question. Entitled it "The Mandarins of Jerusalem." Central European intellectuals, not just German per se, but German-speaking intellectuals who gathered in Jerusalem to establish the Hebrew University. And therefore, we often said the Hebrew University is the last great German university, and that German is the second most important Semitic language. Yeah. Clearly, the intellectual culture, not only of the Hebrew University, but high culture. And one must remember the kibbutz movement was actually inspired by German communal experiments that emerged in the 20s in the Weimar period. Weimar Germany had a strong, or we might say a seminal impact on maybe one term I don't like, but you can call it high culture of the Mandite Palestine and Israel, and still does. As we now somewhat were baffled by the fact that close to 30,000, perhaps more than 30,000 young Israelis now live in Berlin. And we can understand Berlin now as a suburb of Tel Aviv. That article that I wrote on the Mandarins of Jerusalem, which I explore these questions obviously much more expansively than we can do now, opened up with a citation that I found on the wall graffiti in a Berlin subway station, and it's very telling, and I think it explains much of what behind the story of why this fascination with German Jewish intellectuals. Graffiti, I'll translate it from German. It says, one cannot make culture with politics, but one can create politics through culture. The German is a little bit more snappy than I would say it. Let me just say, read the German. Man kann keine Kultur mit der Politik machen, aber man kann Politik mit der Kultur machen. And that is that. As you understand, culture is not simply culture in terms of formalities, but a certain type of sensibility to the spiritual dimension of humanity should be the ground of how we think about how our collective life politically. And I think that still speaks to many young Israelis in particular, that the humanistic cultural sensibilities that flourished in the Weimar Republic and was so cruelly, of course, dashed by Hitler and company, still has significance, and which we should continue to nurture.
I think you must be right among young people, because I have seen graffiti around Tel Aviv saying Buber was right. So I take your book as a revival of the deep humanism.
As a vindication.
No, but as a contribution to the current sort of political and social atmosphere in general in the world, and maybe in Israel too. Paul Mendes-Flohr, thank you so much for being on the show.
I thank you very much indeed.
And thanks to Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review in the ratings and review section. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and by subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with more than 500 interviews. If you like us, you can like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow Gilad and me on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.